Welcome to Flipping the Table. Today, Michael speaks with Helena Bottemiller Evich, founder and editor-in-chief of Food Fix, where she covers food and agriculture policy from the nation's capital. Her 15 years of reporting on the topic makes her the perfect person to give us insights on what is emerging from the confirmation hearings for the Secretaries of Health and Human Services and the USDA. RFK Jr. and Brooke Rollins are not your typical candidates. Helena and Michael explore possible scenarios resulting from the Make America Healthy Again, or MAHA movement, and the growing ecosystem of companies and nonprofits based in Washington, D.C. seeking change. Enjoy the show.
Award-winning Washington, D.C.-based correspondent Helena Bottemiller Evich has been covering the food and agriculture policy beat since Obama was president, which was about the same time that the good food movement began to gain ground in the Farm Bill beyond the organic rule, and in ways that helped to build regional food systems and increased federal support for small and mid-scale farmers. By my quick count, between 2006 and 2018, at least 8 grant programs were born, from farmers market and small producer promotion to nutrition incentives and regional and local food system support. So there's been a steady increase, a change in focus toward the things that many believe make the food system healthier and more resilient, and rural economies more dynamic and diversified. Many of these programs may not survive under the Trump administration. So the early 2000s was also the period in which food safety, climate change, and the impacts of industrial, ultra-processed food became central topics for food system change advocates. Helena has been on top of this array of complex issues as a writer for Food Safety News, Politico, and since 2022 at Food Fix, for which she is the founder and editor-in-chief. Now, Food Fix is a great e-newsletter that comes out weekly and to which I subscribe. As I said, agriculture and food policy are complex. It is really helpful to have a pro reporting and dissecting what is emerging. Food and agriculture policies can also deeply impact our health, local economies, and the environment. And today, Helena is going to share her perspectives on the latest developments around President Trump's picks for USDA and Health and Human Services secretaries. These two departments determine the majority of policies that shape our food systems. Our conversation considers what might be emerging as a consequence of MAHA, or Make America Healthy Again, the new movement with surprising impact on the Trump team. Just look at the February 13th executive order forming the Make America Healthy Again Commission. It reflects the possibilities that Helena and I discussed, so I'm very excited to share this conversation with you. I trust you will enjoy it as much as I did. Helena, good morning. Nice to see you.
Good to see you.
I'm looking forward to the conversation, and always I like to start with the origin story. How did you come to do what you do?
I get asked this a lot because I did not grow up in, food and farming. I think when you work in food and ag policy in DC, you realize a lot of the folks who work in this did grow up in, maybe they grew up on a family farm. I grew up outside of Seattle, and I think I just was more interested in how the food system worked probably than other people, in part because when I was young, I spent a lot of time at my grandpa had a produce market in Southwest Pennsylvania, and I would spend summers there. At my first, the first dollar I earned was at his market, and I remember going to farms to pick up orders. He would buy direct in some cases. He also would buy, he'd go into Pittsburgh and buy off of what is called still the Strip, where the rail cars would come in. Now, at this point, they were not coming in on rail, but I just had, I think, more of an awareness of where food comes from that. But when I went to college, I went to Claremont McKenna College down in California, and there weren't any food and ag policy classes, but I sort of was interested. I'd read Fast Food Nation. I remember that being a really formative book. And it's interesting. Since then, I've gotten to know Eric Schlosser, which has been really, really interesting over the years. But I was just interested. I would consider myself an early student who was interested in these issues. And when it came time to write my thesis as an undergrad, I decided to write it on food policy. I was a government major, and like I mentioned, there was no classes on food and ag policy. But I thought, well, if I have to write a super long paper, I'm going to pick something that I'm interested in that's a little bit different. And I ended up interviewing a lot of people for that thesis. So I remember Marion Nestle took some of my questions over email, and I had just read Food Politics, and I was so like starstruck at the time that she would take my questions. Of course, she doesn't remember this because she's generous and taking questions from everyone all the time. But through that thesis is actually how I ended up falling into journalism and falling into covering food policy because I was actually writing about food safety politics during the Bush administration and how there was a big shift basically that happened between, basically the administration being more deregulatory in how they thought about food to then going through some crises, food safety crises, and then really changing the approach. And that laid the groundwork for the Food Safety Modernization Act, which I then covered at Food Safety News as a cub reporter. So it's sort of
That was the leafy greens,
there was a leafy
leafy
greens outbreak
green
in
thing in California.
2006.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I remember I was in college in California. Well, actually, spinach disappeared everywhere, but I remember spinach disappearing. So you could
Mhm.
not, I mean, spinach just disappeared because they didn't know which spinach was making people really sick. So it was that. Then there was the melamine pet food. A whole bunch of pets got really, really sick, and some died, which was really traumatic for a lot of people. That was pet food coming from China. And then there was also in 2009, right as Obama took office, there was that big peanut butter outbreak where 9 people died, a bunch of kids got sick. And these crises basically got Congress to eventually move and pass really the biggest update to food safety law in about a century. And so because I just written my thesis on that, I was sort of primed to cover it. And right when I moved to Washington, I started reporting at Food Safety News. And food safety all of a sudden was like a very live topic. So Congress was actually holding hearings. Like there were, back when and Congress was much more functional also, I should mention back.
Yes. Right.
So, I remember, Waxman and Markey and John Dingell, like holding hearings and being like, what is going on? And they passed this big law. So because I followed that all really closely, I was able to really jump in and get experience really early. And I've been able to stay focused on food policy throughout my entire career. So that was about 15 years ago. But I always share the story because it all kind of came together accidentally. Now I have a lot of students coming to me that are like, how do I do this? And I'm like, well, you never know where the opportunity is going to come from because this is, well, especially was then a newer area, like where other things like education policy or, maybe finance or energy, they have, I think, more there's more trade publications. There's more, newspapers see those issues as real beats. But back then, and it's still true to an extent now, that really wasn't the case for food and agriculture policy. And so I think a lot of this is still being built, like this idea that you need to cover food in a serious way. And I always say, like, it's the most mainstream niche topic because everyone cares about it and everyone eats, but we still see it as this like narrow thing. So it all kind of came together just out of a personal interest and then an academic interest and then falling into journalism that way. And then so I was at Food Safety News for a couple years, and then I went to Politico and covered food and ag policy there for about a decade. And then in 2022, I left to launch Food Fix, which is my newsletter all about food policy. And that's been really great to have a focused place just for food policy. Shockingly, there actually is not any publication that's dedicated just to food policy other than Food Fix that I know of. And I think
Mhm.
I should have known about it by now. So it's been a really interesting journey. I didn't set out to do this. I didn't set out to be a journalist. I was just personally interested, and it sort of unfolded in this way. But I have come to really feel strongly that these issues, whether it's covering SNAP or the, WIC or FDA regulation, whatever it is, I've come to really feel strongly that these issues deserve more scrutiny, more coverage. I always want to see more reporters at big newspapers covering these issues, more trade publications. Like it is kind of astonishing how few people there are covering this, $2 trillion industry, however you want to count it, in a serious way. So
Yeah,
that's my origin story. And then
it's
it
interesting.
takes me right to my soapbox, which is like everyone should care about this. So
Well, it's actually a great example of how someone finds a focus that they actually feel deeply, like a passion, like you did, and then things start to fall into place because your guiding zone, that thing that perceives, was watching and open, and you found a path. And I actually remember you first because of things that you were writing about the Obama administration. You
yeah.
did this thing where you were covering him on food. I can't remember what it's called. It kind of had a theme, but that's how I first noticed you. You were writing. Do you remember that? What that was?
It might have been through like the agenda. Politico had this like special section where we did policy like explainers, or through Morning Agriculture. Maybe you got the newsletter. That was Politico used to do a daily free newsletter on ag policy. I covered the Obama administration extensively, and in some ways that was good timing because I was at the White House when Michelle Obama launched Let's Move. And I think it was like 6 months after I'd moved to Washington. I remember thinking like, oh, had I come even like a year or two earlier, food would not have been quite as hot a topic, right? It all of a sudden, with all of the fights over school meals, with everything the Obama administration was trying to do, it really did push it up the priority list in terms of like what was actually being talked about.
Yeah, it's interesting. That was a seminal moment. That period,
Hmm.
2008, 9. Obviously, there was this huge background thing of the economy was all messed up. You remember what Obama inherited from the previous administration, the collapse of the economy. But because of Michelle, and also I think there was that 2008 event in San Francisco, Slow Food Nation, where we made the front page of the New York Times. Those things all kind of combined, and you had Schlosser, you had Michael Pollan, you had
Hmm.
you kind of focused, Tom Philpott. Everybody was kind of getting into it then,
Yeah.
and it was a really rich time. Civil Eats grew out of that.
Yeah.
I'm curious about what you said about Food Fix as the only. So you're
Yeah, Civil Eats does some really great policy reporting. Lisa Held is excellent. But I consider them broader than just
yeah,
policy.
they're much
They're covering,
yeah.
I think food culture, they're covering like purchases, business, nonprofit world, like in a way I mean, they really do great work, but I'm pretty narrowly focused on the policy world. So
Which
and
is
on
appropriate. You're
yeah, right. In agriculture, there are more trade publications that do focus. So like, we have AgriPulse and DTN and well, I think DTN's broader, but there's a little bit more, but really what I think is missing is the mainstream outlets. They do
yes.
not see food as a serious beat. They see it as a culinary like a cute thing. Like and I'm not saying that's not important. Like I love reading, the culinary section. It's very important, not just the recipes, the restaurant reviews, like they're tracking cultural trends. Like I'm not diminishing that work, but covering food policy or even food business or covering like the food system as a beat is just different. That means
Yeah,
you're
I
getting into
agree.
like real hard-hitting stuff, you're getting into labor issues, environmental issues, economic issues, massive health issues. I mean, the fun thing about this beat is that it touches so many things. So I always say, like, people think it, sounds narrow until you think about it for like 30 seconds. And then you're like, oh, you're covering education. You are covering the environment and water and labor and health. We have a chronic disease, a huge problem with chronic disease in this country. So that affects healthcare spending, the economy. Like, it gets
Complex.
quickly, and it pains me that more newspapers and media outlets don't see it that way. It's the hill I'll die on, I
Yeah,
think.
well, I think I'm glad you're so committed to it, and I think hopefully with time, and we'll talk about this later. I want to get into this. your comments, you're touching on this other larger topic that I want to get to in this conversation about the coverage of the food systems over the last 15 years. But before we jump into that, I know when we had our previous conversation, you had just been to the Brooke Rollins hearings and you were about to witness the RFK hearings. And a lot has happened in the first 3 weeks of this administration, 2 weeks, whatever it's been, that's impacting our
Week
world.
three. Yeah, I don't know when this is going to air, but we are
Yeah, this is going to air
week three. Yeah.
yeah. What are you seeing? I mean, what are your impressions? What are your early thoughts about what you've seen in these hearings and from these potential leaders of these departments? It sounds like they're both going to get through the process.
Yes, I think it is expected they both will. I think Brooke Rollins will have bipartisan support. We are not yet sure if any Democrats will vote for RFK Jr. Fetterman just recently posted on X that he will not be voting for RFK, and that was one of the Democrats that we thought might possibly vote for him. And he's not voting for Tulsi Gabbard either. So we'll see. He probably doesn't need any Democrats to get through, but we'll have to see. It's going to be an interesting vote. So I watched more than 6 hours of confirmation hearings. There were two committees that had RFK Jr. testify. I think my biggest takeaway from watching all of this, coming from the food angle, is that there was a remarkable bipartisan agreement on many of RFK's positions on like the importance of tackling chronic disease and the role the food system is playing in that. I think I wrote last week for the newsletter essentially that it was like astonishing to not hear any defense of the food industry in these hearings, considering how critical, like very, very critical, RFK Jr. and many of the folks around him have been towards the food system. I mean, they use terms like the American food system is poisoning us, it is poisoning our children. We have all these additives in our food that are not allowed in Europe and other places. I mean, they talk about it in stark terms, like the food industry is getting us addicted, ultra processed foods. I mean, these are not like, oh, we should promote healthy eating. It is really aggressive, especially in terms of what we've seen in Washington, because often these debates get kind of muted. And, you have a lot of corporate interests here who control a lot of the narrative. And so we have not seen really stark criticism of the food industry in the way that RFK Jr. has been, particularly in the last several months as his message has become, I think, more mainstream, in part because of this alliance with now President Donald Trump. And so I kept hearing lawmakers saying things like, I agree with you on food, but I'm really concerned about your criticism of vaccines. And there was a real push to try to get RFK Jr. to step back from past comments he's made about vaccines causing autism. I mean, so many scientific bodies have looked at this like really critically. There's been so many studies. It's not like there's conflicting scientific evidence in terms of like the big credible studies that have been done. Like there's a pretty strong consensus that vaccines do not cause autism. Now, I think the folks who support RFK Jr. would say, like, look, we don't know what's causing this increase in autism in children. Like, everything should be on the table. And I think there's a lot of people who are sympathetic to that idea. But on the other hand, when you keep pushing this narrative, you're increasing vaccine hesitancy and could bring back some like really scary infectious diseases. And so you could tell that Republicans and Democrats were really struggling with the vaccine record of RFK Jr., but they did not seem to be struggling at all with the food
That's
agenda,
great.
which is just, I mean, again, even 6 months, a year ago, it would be unfathomable to have such a stark critic of the food system testify and to not hear any lawmakers bring up like, we need food processing because this is affordable, this is how we get affordable food. This is shelf life. This is, there's no science that says ultra processed food causes obesity or whatever like defense. There was none of that. And it was just stunning for me as someone who has followed this for a long time. The other thing that I'll say real quickly that was so interesting is RFK Jr. was still talking about agriculture policy. So you just brought up Brooke Rollins. I think the conventional wisdom has been that, oh, President Trump picked Brooke Rollins, who's a pretty unknown in this world, but he picked Brooke Rollins. She was not one of the preferred picks of Kennedy world. She was not, they don't really know her. She's not seen as a reformer. They had really big ideas for, changing ag subsidies, just really reforming USDA. So the conventional wisdom is, well, Kennedy World didn't get a reformer there, so ag policy is off limits, right? Like Kennedy's been boxed out. Ag is going to continue on its way, and that's that. Well, during this hearing, RFK Jr. brought up ag policy multiple times. He said, I cannot fulfill the Make America Healthy Again agenda without partnership from farmers. He actually specifically cited concerns about higher rates of Parkinson's among farmers tied to heavy chemical use. I mean, these are, and there is, there's been some studies on
Yeah,
that.
there's
And
data on this. Yeah.
but it's like, again, he was saying that to a farm state senator in this
Right.
hearing, Senator Roger Marshall from Kansas, and it was just one of those moments of like, oh, is this all of a sudden mainstream acceptable Republican fodder? I will see. Like this was just one exchange, but it really stood out to me because I've sat through so many hearings throughout the years where, the main theme is defending, the current agriculture policy, defending the
Status quo.
importance of these inputs, how important it is to the farm economy, how important it is to farmers, how we can't have regulatory overreach. That's always the theme. And then to hear RFK say, like, we got to get farmers off of this heavy chemical use, you're like, oh, I mean, again, he's not leading USDA, but this is a really different message. So we'll
Yeah,
see.
and
We'll
yeah,
see. Like, I'm not saying this is what's going to happen, but to hear him say that unchallenged was really, really interesting.
yeah, that is interesting. And what comes up for me is, what is the tension going to be between Brooke Rollins and him over the next few years? And
Yeah.
where is the president going to come down on that struggle? Because that will be really important. I mean, because I'm sure that the titans of industry in the food processing world are going to be doing what they can to defend what they've got, the status quo. So that will be interesting to watch. It'll be really great for you as a reporter covering that beat. It'll make for some juicy stories.
Although, isn't it a curse to tell people that what is the curse? May you live in interesting times or whatever. It's like it's a curse, not a blessing. So I don't know that I want to say that conflict is a good thing, but it will certainly be interesting. I don't,
Yeah,
yeah,
no, it'll be
it's going to be interesting.
super interesting. So let's switch to this other topic then around, 15 years covering this beat. Very few reporters cover this beat. I think of you, I think of Tom Philpott, I think of the Civil Eats crew, and I'm wondering often what you all think about how the coverage has evolved and what that evolution indicates to us about our culture. And you're kind of touching on it in some of the things you're saying. But why don't you just talk about what you've seen over the last 15 years?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think in some ways the last like 4 to 6 months have been markedly different than, the past couple of years. I mean, we've seen, I think, a real contraction in media generally, right? So there's just like fewer reporters. So a beat that's not seen as critical, like food or food policy or food business, is not going to be covered as robustly. However, with this whole Make America Healthy Again that has really bubbled up into the national consciousness with this like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Trump alliance that we're now calling MAHA, the Make America Healthy Again movement, that has really catapulted this into more mainstream media coverage. So like all of a sudden we are seeing, I think, kind of, I mean, a lot of coverage, which is good. There should be coverage of, who's pushing these debates, like what are they saying? I mean, we should be having that covered because this is a major force in national politics and policy right now. So I think it has changed a lot recently. Over time, I think we have really struggled to see sustained coverage from media outlets for all the reasons I mentioned. It's just, I mean, there's just a real blind spot among like top editors at news organizations. I've seen it time and time again, and it's a big problem. That said, though, over the last 15 years, I have seen just an incredible proliferation of the number of companies, nonprofits, just entities, people that are engaged on food issues here in Washington. So, like, just all this venture capital that went into the food tech world and ag tech, I mean, that has led to a lot more mature companies that are here, that are engaging with regulators, that are like pushing things forward, like, cell cultured world. They're getting USDA money now for research. They're directing, innovation spending. There are so many more players. The food is medicine world has completely blown up in the last couple of years. I went to an HHS event, I think it was last year, on food is medicine. And I don't know that I'd ever even been inside HHS, even though I've been here in Washington for 15 years, because they don't do food stuff. They just don't. I mean, there's just no reason to ever go there. I went to an event there. It was absolutely packed, standing room only. HHS said it was the most popular event they had ever held on any topic, including they had a huge live stream audience on food as medicine, which like,
Yeah, I watched that. Yeah.
I mean, it was fascinating. And so there's another example of just like, whoa. I mean, when I, first started on this beat, none of these players were engaged in food world. The insurers, all of these foundations that are working in this space, this is all new. There's a lot of new energy, money, people. So you've got like all the venture money, you've got all the philanthropy working in the food as medicine space. And then you also have just more people interested. I don't know if you know who Todd Wagner is. He's a philanthropist who was very instrumental in getting the California food additives passed through the legislature, the food additives ban passed through the legislature there. So just more interested people. I think Todd Wagner was pretty involved too in the Food Inc. too. So that was here in Washington. I moderated a panel at the premiere of Food Inc. too. And I mean, Cory Booker and Eric Schlosser and Michael Pollan. And there were a lot of folks from farm workers unions, just all across. And that premiere, I mean, I don't know, there was like a line around the block and a lot of people didn't even get into it because it was so popular. And I just remember thinking like, this is different. Like there is just a lot more interest. There's a lot more energy around, and it's not all going in the same direction, right? Everyone wants kind of different things. It's not like it's some unified and super organized thing, but I am seeing so much more organization, energy, money, interest around just like the concept of like, what are we doing in food and ag? So it's changed a lot. And I think sometimes that's harder for people to see because they're just like, oh, well, like, the food system hasn't like fundamentally changed in 15 years. And like, that's also true. But I think consumer sentiment is also shifting a lot. I have been meaning to grab the transcript of the PepsiCo earnings call, the most recent one, because apparently the CEO said, we're seeing so much interest. Consumers are really talking about like health and nutrition on social media, and it's affecting consumption, like it's affecting sales. And so we are seeing, I think, some ground shifts, some political realignment. The right all of a sudden cares about this, which we should talk about. So there's some really interesting things happening. And I do think there is a more changing right now and more has changed over the last 15 years than I think sometimes we appreciate when we don't kind of step back.
We hope you're enjoying this conversation of Flipping the Table. Please subscribe to this podcast and write us a brief review and give us a rating. These help us to improve the show and to build our audience. More listeners will help grow the movement to make food and farming solutions to many environmental, health, and social problems we face. It's easy. Please subscribe, review, and rate. Now back to the conversation.
So I want to focus on a couple of things that you said. And so Roots of Change is part of something called the Public Health Institute. And we did that because the nexus of public health, nutrition, what you referred to around chronic disease in this country that's related to nutrition, it just seemed like a powerful spot for us to be partnered with. And what you're really talking about is this consciousness that's emerged around the food system's impact on public health. I mean, there's a whole conversation about the environment, and that's really where it started in a way,
Yeah. Yeah.
was the environment. Because of pesticides, going back to 62 probably, and Rachel Carson. But
Yeah.
it seems to me that the more powerful play now is this whole thing about human health because it affects everybody,
Yeah.
every
It's
person.
not abstract. It's
No,
per
it's
Yeah.
not abstract. And so that is a very positive thing. And you're right, the food system has not fundamentally changed over 15 years. But I see a lot of change. One thing that we haven't talked about is you talked about all the people that came to the HHS event and to the Food Inc. too. I went to a lot of and was on panels for the Common Ground, a film that came out around regenerative agriculture.
Yeah.
We got 750 people into a theater in Sacramento. I mean, people came. It was crazy. And I'm like, something's going on.
Yeah. I do think the regenerative ag documentaries, which like I actually have not seen them. I
Mm,
spent so much time reading and being in this world, I have not seen them. I do think those have helped fuel a lot of grassroots interest, piqued a
mhm,
lot of interest in this in a
mhm,
way that, Food Inc. won and Omnivore's Dilemma and some of these books did,
mhm.
what, 15, 20 years ago. So,
There's another wave happening, it seems like.
yes,
That was
yeah,
the
I think
wave.
that's true. I think that's
Yeah,
true.
there's
Yeah.
another wave. So it as a person on that beat, another reason why maybe I'm really curious about what you said about the editors that don't really get it and the big papers and other, electronic media that don't get it. Is it because of the complexity? I mean, it is complex. There's so many linkages. How do you encapsulate it?
I think the complexity is part of it, but I think for some editors, they're still stuck in this like food and agriculture is like a rural thing. It's
Mm,
not an everyone thing. I think once someone becomes interested in like whether it's nutrition, personal health, or whether they're really interested in the environmental, the regen ag stuff, whatever angle they're coming at it, I think once you spend a little bit of time thinking about it, you start to go, oh, this isn't this thing in the corner. This is like a really big topic, right? And I just see a lot of top folks at these news organizations not necessarily seeing it that way. It's just really easy to kind of see it as a third tier
niche.
issue or yeah, so I think the Washington Post, I don't know if this is still true, but I mean they had a reporter like dedicated just to student debt, right? Like important issue. I'm not diminishing it, but you could go through like a long list of issues where like that's worth covering full time, but I can't think of a time where I ever saw the Washington Post at a House or Senate Ag Committee hearing, like covering the Farm Bill, which is like pretty big piece of legislation. Not that they don't cover it at all, but it's sort of like, well, it's an afterthought. It's someone random assigned to it. So, and in some ways, it's the Farm Bill's fault for being, I think, woefully misbranded, right? Like, we shouldn't be calling it the Farm Bill. It's like
Food
85%
bill.
nutrition spending. Yeah. And it affects, like, everything, rural development, obviously, farm subsidies, crop insurance, conservation are all part of it. But, like, it is much bigger than that. And so, part of that is I think we have this archaic understanding of like what these policies are and who they affect. And a lot of people who live in urban areas are pretty disconnected from they hear Farm Bill and they're like, that has nothing to do with me. And it's like, yes, it does, right?
Uh, it's
So
the framing. It's
yeah,
the
I think
framing.
there's a couple layers there, but
It is interesting. It's starting to change because of human
yes.
health, MAHA. And so there seems to me that there's a crack occurring that can be leveraged to make more change. I'm hoping. I mean, the big debate over, you wrote about it in your very great newsletter, which I get, Food Fix, which came out a couple of days ago about this increasing conversation about limiting what SNAP will allow. I mean, that's got to drive the beverage companies crazy because I've understood that funding sources for the purchase of beverages is SNAP.
Yeah, I'm not sure where it fits in terms of the percentage of their overall revenue, but it is a significant percentage of overall SNAP spending. Now, folks who are very, very protective of SNAP and who don't believe we should have any restrictions because it's, patronizing to low-income people, would say, the basket of food purchased by a non-SNAP household and a SNAP household are not that different, right? So it's not like only SNAP households are buying sugary drinks and the rest of us are
Right.
not.
Okay.
But you now have this really loud contingent on the right saying, like, why are we subsidizing any of this? Especially if we know that it is helping to, or in theory, contributing to chronic disease. And so I think this is going to rip open in a big way. And I think the food industry groups and anti-hunger are going to have a really hard time and probably are going to lose this debate because we're seeing a lot of states now say, yeah, we'll run a pilot, we'll try it. I mean, you couldn't do this nationally without Congress. You couldn't say, like, we're kicking all of these products out of SNAP. My understanding is without legislation, which would be very difficult, but you can run pilots at the state level. So we've already seen Governor Sarah Huckabee Sanders in Arkansas. She wrote a letter to Brooke Rollins saying, essentially, I'm going to ask you for permission to do this in Arkansas. And she didn't even just say sugary drinks, she said junk food.
Junk food, I
So
saw that. Yeah, that's
how
big.
you define, how you draw
Yes.
lines around that is going to be a very interesting debate because it's one of those things where it's much more complicated than people think and also not as complicated as everyone because there's a lot of people who go, oh, it's too complicated, you can't do it. Oh, sure, you can. You can draw lines around things. You start getting into, like, is a regular potato chip, maybe that's not a good example. Let's do yogurt.
Yeah.
Yogurt. Okay. Plain yogurt, not ultra processed. So is that a junk food? I think people probably say no. What about strawberry yogurt with just strawberries and a little bit of sugar? Well, what if it's strawberries and a lot of sugar? Where's the line between a little and a lot? Like, I mean, it does. What about flavorings? Are flavorings okay if it's yogurt and, like, overall you'd consider that a health food, but there's, like, what about stevia? You do start to get into some, like, complexity pretty quickly. I think yogurt's a good example, and you can understand why the dairy people are freaking out because there's a lot of dairy products that would be, I don't know, in the margins, but, like, you just wouldn't know naturally where they would fall. Some of the pilot programs around SNAP incentives have promoted dairy, right? Like, they want to promote dairy or promote produce, and actually positive incentives like giving more SNAP dollars to, farmers markets or produce or dairy tend to be where there's a lot of agreement. When you get into the restrictions, dropping foods out of SNAP, that is when it becomes super controversial and there's a lot of disagreement. And also, a lot of the trade associations have essentially been in lockstep against any kind of restriction. Now, none of that will matter if the Trump administration just decides to do it and states ask for it, they can approve those pilots. It's possible that there could be litigation over that, but I think that's where we're going to see a lot of action. It doesn't require any regulation, you
Yeah,
know?
well, this brings us to MAHA and Trump's decision to hitch his wagon to RFK Jr. and RFK Jr.'s willingness to hitch his wagon to Trump. I mean, that was a very interesting
Yeah.
moment in the campaign. What is your sense about the likelihood that MAHA is going to stay central to Trump? I mean, you talked about what you heard in the hearings. I'm very curious if your gut's telling you this is gonna survive and we're gonna actually see, and is it gonna grow? And the fact that Trump joined with RFK before the end of the election, and it didn't affect the vote in the rural communities. I mean, he kept those farming communities, even though you
Yeah.
described what Kennedy's saying, it didn't harm Trump at all.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's really interesting. I have not personally looked at this data, but I keep hearing people in politics land, campaign world say they think that the RFK alliance made a significant difference in the outcome of the election. And so, because of that, I think RFK Jr. has, some political capital here. And I mean, clearly there is, like, a real alliance because Trump named him as HHS secretary, and that's, like, a pretty big position, probably almost $2 trillion in health spending going through HHS. Like, it's a big agency, of course, that oversees FDA, CDC, and NIH. So this is not some consolation prize. This is a real job with impact. And actually, I just saw the Wall Street Journal broke, and I have not read it yet, but there's apparently going to be an executive order to lay off thousands of workers at HHS. I mean, there's just going to be a lot of questions, right, about what exactly they're going to do, how they're going to do it. I have a lot of questions on the additive front. So, one of the big MAHA agenda items, and we should maybe define this a little bit, but basically, in the run up to Trump winning the election, RFK Jr. wrote an op ed in the Wall Street Journal called Trump Can Make America Healthy Again, or something like that. And if anyone's interested in sort of looking at the broad tenets of the agenda, this is a good place to start. And one of those was to stop subsidizing, I believe it was sugary drinks and ultra processed foods and SNAP. That was one of the agenda items. But another one was to essentially crack down on food chemicals. Like, why do we have all of these generally recognized safe substances in the food supply? Many of the, I mean, FDA doesn't actually know. They don't have to get notified when these substances come on the market. And so essentially, like, why don't we have stricter control of this? But to meaningfully crack down on food additives, like, you have to regulate. There's no way around that, right? Like, that's just the way forward if you wanted to actually crack down on that issue. Change policy in any way, like, it has to result, I think, to be MAHA in some of these additives getting pulled off the market. And I don't yet see specifics about how they're going to do that or if they're going to actually be given a green light to regulate because we have Elon Musk now coming in with this Department of Government Efficiency, which everyone's calling DOGE, and they're taking a sledgehammer to these agencies. I mean, USAID, I think as of right now, kind of doesn't exist anymore. We'll see like where the courts come down on that. Department of Education is about to be on the chopping block. We don't yet know what it's going to look like at an agency like FDA or USDA, but just in terms of how policy works, I have a lot of questions about this. Like, parts of the MAHA agenda are regulatory. How will that work in this environment? We don't know. If you zoom out, though, it's really easy for me to be like, let's get into the details. What's the plan, right? And this is what I've been asking all the folks in Kennedy World, and I don't have a good answer yet. But what's interesting to me, if you zoom out of this into the specifics, what's going to happen, what's not, I think the political realignment, the MAHA energy on the right, like this is a real part of Trump's base now. That is the thing that I think could be more durable, even if, like, let's say RFK comes in, there ends up being controversy, maybe he doesn't last that long. I have no idea what's going to happen, right? But you have now this whole army of wellness influencers, of, moms, of like very vocal supporters of this agenda who want change, who want crackdown on additives, who want basically a different food system than we have. And they have really found traction on the right. And I think that's the thing to watch. Like, is that durable beyond like whoever is in the cabinet? Seeing folks on the right in Congress, like farm state senators, embrace some of these ideas has been, I mean, it's just happened really quickly. And even watching how Senator Cassidy, who's the Louisiana Republican chairman of the Senate Health Committee, he's also on the Senate Finance Committee. So he voted on whether or not RFK was going to advance. He's a physician. He really struggled with the decision of whether or not to vote in support of RFK Jr. But he acknowledged, like, his phone was ringing off the hook with all of these MAHA supporters, many of them moms, who maybe were not even politically active in any way before this. And so you're starting to see some real political force. Does that continue? Is this something that politicians become afraid of? Like, we'll see. But I think that's such an interesting element to watch. It's harder to predict, like, what's a cabinet person going to decide on or whatever. But watching the scale of these new sort of political actors has been really fascinating, and it's happened really quickly. Like, even
Yeah, Cory Booker must really be watching this because Cory Booker has been in that world. He's been a MAHA-esque type of player for a long time on the food system. I mean, he has been calling out these things. And so his eyes must be like, whoa, like spinning in his head, looking at this.
He posted a video about, I think it was about like corporate capture in food and ag several weeks ago, and like RFK Jr. retweeted it and was like, look forward to working with you, Senator. Like, thanks for being, it was something like, thanks for being a leader on this. I mean, it's been wild to watch. Like, a lot of these ideas were absolutely left, coming from the more liberal, like food movement, grassroots ideas, voices, and had been adopted by more progressive members. Rosa DeLauro, Cory Booker, Tim Ryan. And now you hear like almost the exact arguments in some ways, in some cases, being made on the right. Now, the right is more likely to blame government and the left is more likely to blame corporations.
Yes.
But
Good point.
Bernie Sanders even is now, I mean, he's become interested in chronic disease, like, I don't know, in the last year or year and a half. I never heard him bring this up. And when he was chair of Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee in the last Congress, he was holding hearings, like railing on the food industry for, fueling chronic disease epidemic. And I think he was really coming at it from like, now we have all this GLP-1s like Ozempic and Mounjaro and all these pharmaceuticals. It sparked this whole reckoning of
Yeah,
like,
and
oh, this could bankrupt us.
yeah, well, it also began, I think, back with the Green New Deal for him because he was bumping up against AOC around that, and they were talking about Cory Booker was in that conversation. So I think it expanded Bernie, Sanders' thinking at that time,
Hmm.
and that was many years ago now. But we're at the end here of our time. But I wanted to just say the way you describe the MAHA, it is a movement. I mean, when
Yeah.
people are making phone calls to their senators off the hook,
Like
that means
taking
there's a
down phone
movement.
systems. Yep.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So you also talked about the fact that a lot of this started with the left and the foodies in that world, the good food movement people there. Is it possible in your mind that we get some sort of right and left come together and the place that they're meeting is around the food system?
I do think that might be what's happening right now. It's sort of a situation where a lot of the policies, there seems to be agreement. I still saw a lot of folks on the left opposing RFK, even though they maybe did agree on the food things. Like I think actually Michael Pollan had
Yeah, I saw it.
I think he did a
Yeah.
Q&A with Politico because some people were, I think, wrongly speculating that he was sort of endorsing Robert F. Kennedy Jr. because he agrees on a lot of the food and ag stuff, maybe not all of it, but a lot of it.
Yes.
And he did a Q&A with Politico and basically said, look, I think his like views on vaccines and these other health, public health things are disqualifying. Like I don't support him, but kind of separated out the agreement. So I think it's possible that this movement is coalescing around a common set of ideas and policies that folks on the left and the right do agree on. But I do think there will continue to be polarization on like who is making decisions. So it's not necessarily that everyone's going to support RFK Jr., although I mean we'll see. I don't know. I think he is the most popular. Yeah, I think he is the most popular or at least like known cabinet official or soon to be if he's confirmed in the next few days. So we'll see.
Yeah.
It
If he doesn't get confirmed, it could all go away. But if he does get confirmed,
or
it could
he'll
keep it
be an
alive.
outside force. I really don't know where all this energy will go. One thing that I think is interesting to point out here, a lot of people in the beginning were like, well, Trump doesn't care about this. He eats McDonald's, he eats Diet Coke. He doesn't hide this. This isn't like, I'm not bashing him. He like is very clear about his love of these foods. He even had RFK eating these foods
Burgers, yeah.
on airports or I think it was on Trump's plane, but they're like, Trump doesn't care about this. And I do think, we haven't seen evidence that he like personally has like wakes up thinking about these issues. But if you go back and you watch the rally where RFK, I think it was in Arizona, where RFK Jr. comes on stage and endorses Trump. And when they start saying, make America healthy again, and Trump says, get the toxins out of food, and the crowd is cheering, like there's really something they're tapping into. One thing Trump is good at, and I think even the people who hate him would acknowledge this and agree with this, is finding and identifying like energy. And
Right.
they have identified energy here in a way that I think has surprised a lot of people. So whether or not Trump himself cares about these issues, there is an acknowledgement, I think, that there is energy here, that there are people who are very fired up about this. And now we'll see what happens with that. But, in some ways, I think the food movement, the good food movement, whatever groundswell there's been in terms of like awareness, in some ways has primed us for MAHA, which I think has left a lot of folks on the left has left their heads spinning because they're like, wait, this was a progressive issue, right? Like, so it's in some ways been disorienting for a lot of people, but I think that's kind of what we're seeing. I think you're right. It is the left and the right meeting. I don't know. I don't know where all this is headed, but it's I think something that like political scientists will be
Well,
for a long time. Yeah.
yeah, and I'm really glad that that we're subscribed to Food Fix, because I think it'll help us follow what's going on, your good work. I really want to thank you, Helena, for spending the time to talk through this complex stuff and very interesting stuff. And congratulations on 15 years of good work. Look forward to more, and we'll stay in touch. And maybe next year we'll catch up with you again and hear what you think.
Yes. Thank you so much. And just so folks know, they can get Food Fix for free on Fridays. Just go to foodfix.co and you can sign up. I really believe in having a free version so anyone can read it, so consumers anywhere can read it. And then we, of course, also have a paid version so folks can get it twice a week.
Yeah, which is good. I think the paid version for anyone who works in our world, all my colleagues and all those folks should and companies, that it's a good investment. It's not crazy expensive. It's worthwhile. So I hope more people will subscribe.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And thanks for having me. I mean, this is a great platform to have these more nuanced conversations. So keep it up.
All right. You take care.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed the show. Please share it with your friends and listen to our next monthly episode of Flipping the Table, hosted by Roots of Change, a program of the Public Health Institute, a nonprofit organization dedicated to building a healthier world.